Thank you.
Senator Warnock of Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Chair Brown. The United States has become increasingly reliant on sanctions as a foreign policy tool over the past 20 years. I remain concerned that untargeted sanctions may only harm the poorest of the poor throughout the world. Oftentimes, economic sanctions, as well-intentioned as they may be, are not felt by the governing class, the people who are actually making the decisions. Instead, they're felt by the poor and the meek, those with little say over the activities of those in power. They're literally caught in the crossfire. There's an old African statement that when the elephants fight, the grass suffers. Deputy Secretary Adeyemo, shortly after you took office in 2021, you led a broad review of the sanctions administered and enforced by the Treasury Department. What were the review's findings regarding how we can best ensure that our sanctions have the intended effect and deter bad behavior?
So, Senator, I appreciate you asking this question because I think it is an issue that we don't speak enough about, which is that we need to make sure that our sanctions are targeted towards the threat actors and that we do as much as possible to reduce the harm against innocent individuals. That's why one of the findings of the sanctions review was the need to have very clear humanitarian carve-outs for the vast majority of our sanctions programs. But in addition to that, we needed to make sure that these sanctions are tied to a clear foreign policy objective, and that, two, they are narrowly targeted in order to make sure that we have an impact on the threat actor, but not on the overall population. I think the findings of that sanctions review has influenced what we've done with regard to Russia and continues to influence the way we think about using sanctions going forward.
Thank you so much. It's so important that the sanctions do what they're actually intended to do and that we don't create needless harm on suffering and innocent people who are already marginalized. Speaking of humanitarian aid, and you talked about these humanitarian carve-outs as part of your response given the findings of the study. As you know, Gaza is experiencing right now a humanitarian crisis of unspeakable at unspeakable levels. The trickle of aid entering Gaza is not nearly enough, not even close, to meet the needs of the Palestinian people. And the majority of Palestinians in Gaza are at severe risk of famine. We must ensure that U.S. policy is not standing in the way of providing urgent humanitarian assistance to Palestinian civilians, particularly the children. And at the same time, there's a real risk of terrorist groups like Hamas diverting aid for its own benefit. That's why I was glad to see Treasury issue guidance on providing humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people without inadvertently financing Hamas very shortly after October 7th. Deputy Secretary Adeyemo, can you update us on the implementation of this guidance regarding issuance of general licenses and regarding oversight?
So, Senator, one of the early things we did after Hamas's brutal attack on Israel was take actions to go after Hamas's finances. But we also sat down with financial institutions and humanitarian groups to make sure that they had the ability to continue to provide legitimate aid and financial assistance in Gaza. One of the things that we learned at that point was the challenge wasn't U.S. sanctions given our humanitarian carve-out, but were the sanctions put in place by some of our allies. Soon after, I traveled to Europe and with our European allies work with them to put in place a similar humanitarian carve-out in their program in order to put us all in the same position where we could both target actions to go after Hamas, but to ensure that legitimate humanitarian assistance could flow through. My goal and my team's goal is to continue to meet with financial institutions, but also with aid groups to ensure that our sanctions are in no way prohibiting the legitimate flow of financial resources and other resources into Gaza, because to your point, I agree that not enough is being done, not enough is getting through, and we have to do everything in our power to make sure that we change that dynamic.
So what needs to happen for the delivery of aid to be more effective?
So, Senator, this is not primarily in my domain. The issues that are in my domain, though, are making sure that financial resources are able to flow. And the goal there has to be the continued engagement, not only of the United States government, but of the UK government and the EU government, the countries that are primarily putting sanctions in place, with our financial institutions and with our humanitarian groups, to ensure that they are not in any way being blocked in the delivery of legitimate humanitarian assistance. What I've heard from those groups to date is that the challenge they face is a fiscal one in terms of being able to get aid in, not a financial one. But what I've also told them is the moment they feel as if in some way they have a financial block, I want them to call me immediately, because our goal is to make sure that our sanctions are targeted towards Hamas, not towards impacting the innocent Palestinian people.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so very much. We have to work to ensure that there's rigorous oversight of aid to Palestinians, working also with our European and other allies to both ensure that it actually provides assistance to those in need. And we want to certainly make sure that Hamas does not divert any sort of aid for its own purposes. Thank you so very much, Mr. Secretary.
Thanks, Senator Warnock. Senator Britt of Alabama is recognized.